welcome everybody. Isabella, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for making time this afternoon.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Francois. So this is, as you can see from the title, which I hope you can see now, the slides, right? It's a talk about framing, right? It's a slightly abridged version, but basically more or less the same as a talk I've given recently in October at a conference in Portugal. The examples I will use, as you suggested, are involve the framing of the riots that followed the Southport murders at the end of July. So the riots that happened in Britain in August. Of course, the talk was for a different audience there, because this was a keynote at an argumentation conference. I've taken out a bit of the more technical stuff, but I will be mentioning some concepts that won't be familiar. However, I hope it will still be comprehensible. So here it goes. There is an idea in argumentation theory these days, especially in the pragma-dialectical approach of the Amsterdam School, that framing can be discussed as an instance of strategic maneuvering at all the stages of a critical discussion. But I won't go into this because this is a technical concept that you are not familiar with. But what I can say is that I think we are all used to thinking about framing in terms of in such terms as those suggested by communications theorists like Entman and others, who see it as involving selection and salience. And some of my examples of framing will be indeed very salient, and some will be less so. With any highly controversial issue, there is a battle of arguments out in the open, but also a more obscure battle over the territory on which the battle is fought. And each party will be trying to attract the opponent to a territory where they might win more easily, hence the strategic maneuvering idea. To make their disagreement fully explicit, however, some expansion, some drilling down, and this is another concept that somebody has suggested in argumentation theory, drilling down to what the parties take as unquestionable common sense may be necessary. Now, salient framing in the minor premise of an argument, in the first premise, relies on shared, in doxa they're called, shared beliefs that the public has in the unexpressed premises, which the audiences will easily supply. So salient framing can also take place in the major premise, in the second premise, which is usually left explicit, and which is not always expressing a shared common belief, but they may be presenting it as shared common sense. So non-salient framing, in my view, relies on such endoxa, such alleged common beliefs, which, if made fully explicit, might not always command agreement, which is why they are best left unexpressed. So this is mainly the kind of framing that I want to talk about. And challenging this kind of framing is not done by moving the argument forward at the argumentation stage, but by pushing it back to see what is taken for granted by one party at the opening stage that may not be acceptable to the other party. So I'd like to start from a quote, a very puzzling quote from a Substack post by Konstantin Kisin that you may be familiar with, the British-Russian commentator, who is half of the famous trigonometry YouTube duo. In a post in August entitled "Why We Keep Losing the Immigration Debate," he said this: "In a battle, the deciding factor between comparable armies is often the territory on which the fight happens. You do not win debates with arguments. You win them by setting the frame." The kind of frame that he speaks about is not one of those salient frames and involves, in my analysis, some normative priorities that are taken for granted as common sense by one arguer, but may not be at all shared by his opponent. So he goes on like this: "The reason the debate about immigration is as absurd as it is in the Western world is that we are operating within a morality-based framing of the issue. And as long as we continue to do so, we will continue to lose. What is the frame that is most popular? Immigration," he says, is a good thing. That is the frame. Therefore, anyone who opposes immigration is a bad person. Once this framing is set, arguments are largely irrelevant. You can quote statistics, facts, figures till you're blue in the face, but all you will ever be is an angry racist. What he says may sound somehow simplistic or at least surprising or puzzling, so let's see what else he says to understand what he means. Instead of the moral framing, Kissing suggests that we should view immigration as being either desirable or undesirable, depending on what the host country needs and what costs and benefits immigration generates. The advice he was giving to a gathering of politicians in Australia was this: the most important thing is not allow immigration to become a moral issue, not to frame it in moral terms, because then you will invariably lose the argument. What he presumably means is that mass immigration ought not to be addressed from the viewpoint of absolute moral imperatives and instead take a consequentialist, more contextual and flexible approach. We in fact see this moral framing that he seems to be talking about. We see it in many situations. It informs the ethics of various pro-migration charitable organizations, left-wing parties, and not only. In a BBC interview in September, former Conservative PM John Major said that sending illegal migrants to Rwanda, as the Tories planned to do, was unchristian and odious. Various prominent men of the church often say similar things. We are all brothers and sisters. We have duties towards one another as Christians, and doing otherwise is ungodly, unchristian, sinful, and so on. No one, however, has any practical solutions to the problem of mass migration, and no one seems to think of the consequences on the host nation. And we see the same moral message in these slogans that are usually projected on the White Cliffs of Dover by various charitable humanitarian organizations. But we could say to Kissing, well, a consequentialist perspective like this one that you're advocating is in fact also a moral perspective. So you cannot rule out the moral perspective altogether. So two protagonists in a debate could in fact even agree that immigration is a moral issue to some extent. But then they could draw opposite conclusions. One of them could conclude that immigration ought to be stopped. The other could conclude that immigration ought to continue. Why is this possible? Because they have different ways of understanding what the moral point of view is. And even within the same conception, if they could agree on one, they might still be arguing from the perspective of different groups affected. For example, consequences for the migrants versus consequences for the host population, duties towards migrants versus duties towards the UK population, and so on. At this point, we have a reasonable disagreement that could be resolved, at least in principle. But as I will try to show, if we drill down even deeper, we might enter a territory where the parties might be so entrenched in their position that resolution seems illusory. One side can never win, and I do not mean by this that they cannot win because of factors outside discourse. For example, who has the political power to decide, although this is of course always very important. I mean that one side can never win the argument because the other side always seems to have the better argument. And I will come back to this. Now, in my view, framing from an argumentative perspective, of course, aims to provide an audience with a persuasive reason why they ought to believe something or act in some way. That reason may, of course, not be a good reason in the sense of surviving questioning, but it is nevertheless advanced as being a good reason. The obvious question is, of course, where are those normative or evaluative premises coming from that can justify drawing a normative practical conclusion and thus avoid moving from is to ought in an unreasonable way? So I suggest that framing involves two main mechanisms, sometimes working in combination, and both of them raise the is-ought problem unless the arguments contain a normative evaluative middle premise, that endoxon I was speaking about. So either you're being persuaded or directed towards seeing situation X, whatever it is, as being a case of X and not Y. And this can come in various versions, covering most simple argument schemes. For example, you could say situation S can be classified as being an X, or a sign of X, or an example of X, or a criterion for being X, and so on, or S is analogous to X, or S is a cause or effect of X, or is best explained by X, and so on. Therefore, you should believe or act in a certain manner, which follows from accepting the framing, given the uncontroversial endoxen which you already share as a common belief. Or you are being steered towards taking some reason X and not Y and not Z or anything else as outweighing other possibly competing reasons in deciding what to believe or do about the situation. So the bridge from is to ought, the is of the premises to the ought of the conclusion, can therefore come in a very straightforward, predictable way from the semantic frame, that is, from the lexical meaning, or from the cognitive frame, from what people, from what you know about something, from your own evaluative attitudes and beliefs, your own ideological convictions, and so on. But sometimes it may come from taking for granted and not questioning, because it doesn't occur to you to question, priorities that are suggested to you by the so-called framing elites, journalists, politicians, and so on. If these priorities were made fully explicit in the argument, you may find you don't actually share them, or you would want to challenge them, because somebody is making decisions that will affect others based on normative priorities which they, as decision makers, are imposing on a public who would not necessarily agree that those priorities ought to be theirs as well. So we have all encountered the framing of migration as an invasion, right? A salient analogy or metaphor to which we can provide a shared endoxen, a middle premise, from our understanding of what invasion means, from our invasion frame, right? So the same with the framing of migration in terms of its economic costs, whether you are arguing that migration is beneficial or detrimental. The unexpressed evaluative premise is straightforward and acts as a bridge that takes you to the normative conclusions that you're expected to draw. But sometimes we argue like this from competing goals, and we take one goal to outweigh the other. The same goes for alternative consequences or values. The normative premise here, which is in blue italics, expresses the arguer's own order of priorities. This is the kind of non-salient framing expressing overriding priorities, which may be unrevisable for the speaker, that I said is often left unexpressed because it is highly controversial sometimes. That level of background assumption that attempts to skew the conclusion towards one side only. So, in an article I wrote in 2018, I looked at the way Angela Merkel's decision to open the borders to Syrian refugees in 2015 was discussed in the German press, mainly in some articles in Der Spiegel. There, someone was saying that the words of a man of the church that Angela Merkel had met at a concert about that time had made a very strong impression on her. And that man of the church quoted Václav Havel saying, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out." This kind of conviction and this kind of priorities, that is acting on principles regardless of consequences, was said to be her driving force at the time. I would, however, notice that Havel, in having the courage to speak truth to power, was prepared to bear the consequences himself. What Merkel was doing was acting from her own moral sense, but imposing consequences on the German people. The overall evaluation in the material I was looking at was negative. Fulfilling what she felt were her moral obligations towards the refugees as a minority. She had, those journalists and commentators argued, she had failed in her obligations towards the whole German people and also in her duties as chancellor, which dictated that her priorities ought to have been different. So Merkel's decision, whatever we think of it, showed the conflict between moral conceptions within the moral point of view, between acting from moral imperatives, from a Kantian deontological kind of perspective, or from compassionate humanitarian or Christian charity reasons, an ethics of virtue, and the consequentialist ethics that considers impacts on others. All of these are in fact moral perspectives, but grounded in different conceptions of justice. They can be in conflict, as the Merkel example shows, because in trying to do what you think is morally right with regard to one group of people, you may be doing the wrong thing to another group of people, unless you take consequences, including long-term consequences on everyone, into account, and unless your priorities are very, very carefully considered. So coming back now to Kissin's idea of breaking the frame, two parties who disagree on what should be done about a particular problem can challenge their opponent's salient framing, thereby fighting with arguments on a given battleground. For example, they can deny that the situation should be seen as X and not as Y. But they can also try to reframe the discussion as if saying, there is another more important conversation that we ought to be having, which this one is framing out. Or there is another perspective or another angle on this. In this way, trying to change the battleground itself, move it to a more strategically advantageous area. There is, in fact, a good metaphor for the situation when one protagonist deliberately avoids discussing an issue because it would not be to his advantage. And of course, this is the metaphorical elephant in the room. Choices that are made at the confrontation stage may be intended precisely to obscure the inconvenient elephants that audiences had better not think about. But reframing at the opening stage of an argument, for example, shifting the angle from a moral one to an economic one, or from an alleged overriding duty to be kind to an overriding duty to think of the consequences of such kindness, may require some drilling down to the deeper sources of disagreements, to that alleged common sense that each party takes for granted. When we look at what people take for granted at the opening stage, we will find different evaluative propositions, different value priorities. Not everyone will agree, for example, on reflection, if this was made fully explicit, that a charitable, compassionate point of view towards a particular group of people should always outweigh all other reasons. By trying to uncover deeper layers of alleged common sense, the parties will reveal to each other the fact that their priorities might be set quite differently. Hence, their disagreements are even more intractable than it originally appeared. And they may, in fact, discover not only that their common sense is not shared by the others, but also they might discover their own deep generative grammar of their own worldview as a possibly quite welcome side effect of this. So, through which lens or lenses should we look at a problem? While Entman's classic definition in terms of selection and salience seems to cover the confrontation and the argumentation stage, and I realize that these are not technical terms that you're familiar with, argumentation in the pragma dialectical conception, it can be split into 4 stages: confrontation, opening, argumentation, and concluding. There are definitions in the literature on framing that are framed exactly in terms of angle or perspective, which is why this picture, which I once discovered online, I always show to my students to illustrate this kind of definition of framing as the angle through which you look at something. So this angle seems to be set at the opening stage, where there can be implicit or explicit agreement, and it is an aspect of strategic maneuvering, as in fact has been observed in pragma dialectics. As Frans van Emmeren says, the choice of angle is one of the first topical choices being made. In my view, it will place the disagreement on a particular battleground, generating arguments of a particular kind, for example, in terms of moral principles. So if we look at this issue as a moral issue, then the arguments that we expect to be put forward will be moral arguments, and the same goes for any other perspective. But instead of moving forward from agreement, the conversation might be suddenly pushed back as the arguers realize that what they mean by the moral perspective, which they took for granted as a shared material starting point, may be very different. The demands of compassion clashing with those of consequences, the demands of justice as fairness possibly clashing with those of justice as entitlement or as desert, and also that when they take any of these conceptions as a normative priority, they may also find themselves prioritizing for different groups of people. So I'd like to discuss a particular example that we are by now familiar with, and a very tragic one, the framing of the August 2024 riots following the murder of several children at a dance class in Southport on the 29th of July by a young man, second-generation immigrant with a family originating from Rwanda. The riots erupted in many cities, particularly in the Northwest, and lasted, as we know, for a week. So for convenience, with the risk of oversimplification, I will use these metonymic terms, Planet Guardian, to refer metonymically to the radical progressive left view, typically promoted by The Guardian and other similar newspapers, also by the Labour Party. Planet Telegraph would be the conservative view, often a national conservative view. So Planet Guardian framed the rioters as far-right thugs, racists, far-right extremists who are attempting to sow hate and so on. The riots were said to be caused by disinformation on social media promoted by far-right opinion leaders in a climate of anti-immigrant rhetoric, racism and hate speech. Now, Planet Telegraph did something quite different. They did accept the framing by classification in terms of thugs, and they agreed fully that violence was unacceptable. It was not acceptable to attack police officers, to set buildings on fire, and so on. But they said the rioters were not far right, but local people in deprived areas with large migrant communities reacting to yet another murder, this time the horrific murder of children, on the assumption that the killer was a recently arrived Muslim asylum seeker, based on previous cases of crimes committed by asylum seekers. The riots were said to be caused by the failure of successive governments to stop mass immigration and the rising levels of crime committed by immigrants, failure of integration of these immigrants in a context where all legitimate criticism of migration policies have for decades been labeled racist and Islamophobic. So perhaps a few facts and figures are needed here. The Ministry of Justice has recently published some statistics saying that foreign criminals in Britain who avoided deportation committed more than 10,000 criminal offenses in just 1 year, serious offenses, and nearly 40,000 criminal offenses were committed in the last 4 years. A quarter of these foreign criminals went on to reoffend after being released from prison and managing to avoid deportation. The Office for National Statistics has said that 86% of all immigration into Britain comes from outside Europe. Only 16% of these immigrants since 2018 came to work on work visas of skilled kind of labor. The cost of supporting asylum seekers, for example, the hotel bill, was 4 billion in 22-23. It has risen to 5.4 billion in 23-24. Compare this to the 20 billion hole that the Chancellor claims to have found. Okay. Also, the Office for National Statistics said that in the year ending in June 23, net migration reached over 900,000 people, updating thus their own previously released figure of 740, so now it's nearly 1 million. They also revised their previous estimate from 700,000 to nearly 900,000, which means that more than a city the size of Birmingham has been added to the UK population every year in recent years. Okay, so in the wake of the riots, as we all know by now, what happened was that more than 1,200 people were arrested. There were hundreds of convictions for violent disorder. Prison sentences were handed out, but also there were dozens of sentences for online offenses between 3 months and 3 years for publishing online material intended to stir racial hatred and distributing fake news and so on. And for all of these, the recorded incident location was said to be online. It has suddenly become apparent in the UK that you could go to prison for something you have posted on Facebook or WhatsApp. Consequently, there was an avalanche of requests for new membership of the Free Speech Union. Only in the month of August, immediately after the riots, 4,000 new people joined the Free Speech Union to gain some legal protection for potential online offenses they might be accused of having committed. I know these figures because I've been a member of the Free Speech Union for quite a while. Now, the framing in the press was extremely different on the two so-called ideological planets. And this is Owen Jones in The Guardian. The Southport riot brought to light the horrifying undercurrents in British politics. Attention must be paid to Twitter, a cesspit of disinformation and far-right talking points. Social media spread false claims that the suspect was a Muslim asylum seeker arrived by boat. In fact, he is a Cardiff-born Briton with no links to Islam. The toxicity of social media is just one ingredient. Rumors are only effective if there is a receptive audience, and there is a receptive audience because there has been a homegrown far right on these islands for decades. And he goes on like this. Crucially, there is a right-wing populist ecosystem which was lacking before, stretching from conservative politicians to Nigel Farage. Islamophobia has become a pervasive and respectable bigotry in the UK. At the end of the 2010s, more than a third of Britons, 20 million adults, believed Islam was a threat to the British way of life. Today's far right has latched onto this widespread and mainstream bigotry. Anti-migrant, anti-refugee frenzy whipped up by right-wing media and politicians and so on. Suella Braverman is especially singled out for the invasion metaphor and so on. A Guardian editorial was more or less the same lines at the time, saying it's not enough to look at these events as violent disorder and criminality. Hundreds of rioters mobilized through social media brought the spirit of the far-right pogrom to the streets of our towns and cities. As Dame Sarah Khan, the independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience, said, that did not come about in a political vacuum. The inflammatory rhetoric deployed by successive conservative governments in relation to immigration has palpably nourished extremism. And again, Nigel Farage is cited here. Thankfully, Suella Braverman is no longer in government, but the relentless framing of immigration as a menace to the nation, which comes from conservative quarters, and the pernicious racist narratives and extremism and so on, have led to this mainstreaming and normalization of far-right discourses on immigration in Britain. And she advises that the reality of Britain as a multicultural society needs to be defended and celebrated instead. Yvette Cooper, Home Secretary, threatened the full force of the law for poisonous ideologies that corrode cohesion and so on. Thugs, extremists, full force of the law and so on. Now, on Planet Daily Telegraph, the framing was, as we might expect, different. A Daily Telegraph report on what a Tory policing chief had suggested said this. A Tory policing chief has suggested that mass uncontrolled immigration is one of the reasons behind the rioting. Donna Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, compared the riots to a rebellion to illegal immigration. I've spoken to people from both sides of the spectrum, and the only way to stem the tide of disorder is to acknowledge what is causing it, she said. While the devastating attacks were a catalyst, the commonality amongst all the protesters appears to be focused on three key areas: the desire to protect Britain's sovereignty, the need to uphold British values, and in order to stop this, stop illegal immigration. Arresting people, she said, was treating the symptom and not the cause. And a similar view from Matt Goodwin, the political scientist with a Substack that is hugely popular. Originally he's from the University of Kent, you may be familiar with him. He also said immediately, this is not simply about far-right thuggery, this is about the unraveling and disastrous effects of an elite project that has hollowed out and weakened Britain over many years, a project that has subjected the British people to increasing crime and chaos and chilling atrocities while simultaneously expecting them not to react at all. What is happening in Britain right now is the culmination of decades of disastrous policies by our ruling class, the same class that is now rushing to discredit anybody who criticizes them. The policy of mass immigration, which the vast majority of people neither asked for nor voted for. The complete breakdown of borders. So what the discussion ought to be about on this conservative perspective is not disinformation and racism as alleged root causes, but the loss of control over immigration and its consequences on the British people as real root causes. And just one more quote from the Daily Telegraph, Camilla Tomini said this: "Ever the lawyer, the Prime Minister has treated the unrest as a case to be prosecuted rather than a problem to be solved. He has shown all the legal competence of a former director of public prosecutions, but he has forged no connection with the client in his case, with the great British public. Asked by GB News, is now the time to engage with the underlying tensions that are within communities over the issue of immigration, Starmer couldn't find an answer. He cannot lead with his head buried in the sand." Okay, so Planet Telegraph is fighting, therefore, Planet Guardian on the latter's own battleground to some extent, right, by challenging their arguments, denying that the rioters were far right, challenging the identification of the root causes. But they're also trying to change the battleground to a more strategic location, to reframe it and bring the metaphorical elephant into view, as well as change the perspective. Look at migration from the viewpoint of the British people. Think of the consequences you are forcing on them. So Planet Telegraph was actually very good at doing what in argumentation theory is exploiting the shared starting points. So it's like saying, okay, we agree that dealing with the riots is a matter of justice and enforcing the rule of law. We agree with that, no problem. However, if violence is unacceptable and unjustifiable now, we agree on that, why was it not unacceptable or unjustifiable on other occasions? So the government's current material starting point seemed to be in conflict with the starting points they had on similar occasions. When minorities are violent, the government finds justifications. When members of the majority population turn violent, there is no excuse. And this is how a set of new memes suddenly became very popular at the time: two-tier policing, two-tier justice, two-tier care, and so on, classificatory terms for perceived evidence of double standard. Violence by white majority is allegedly treated differently from violence by ethnic minorities. And here is a very rhetorically effective passage about double standards from Matt Goodwin from his own Substack. Is the elite class calling for clampdowns the same class that cheered on protests by BLM? Is the elite class that was so quick to talk about the legitimate grievances behind BLM rioting across the West the same class that now refuses to acknowledge that this far-right thuggery is also rooted in wider grievances? Is Keir Starmer, the man denouncing these protests as far-right thuggery, the same Keir Starmer who rushed to take the knee days after Black Lives Matter protesters broke the law, injuring 30 police officers? Is the elite class that is rushing to denounce the protests the same class that remained largely silent as anti-Semites and Islamists marched up down the country celebrating the murder and rape of Jews? In 2020, he says the media had no problem with BLM and the riots. As far as it was concerned, these riots were not an explosion of violent, antisocial, and criminal behavior at times, but simply justice-motivated protests. Some intellectual supporters even justified the acts of destruction and looting. The contrast between the response to the BLM riots and the contemporary explosion of communal violence in the UK is striking. The media and the dominant elites are not interested in understanding the motives for the British rioters. As far as they're concerned, they are riots without any comprehensible cause. So this is a quote from Frank Furedi, also originally from the University of Kent. He also has a very popular Substack. And he says, the media narrative that blames EDL and right-wing individuals and so on with formidable organizing resources is and remains an invention, the invention of the propaganda machine of the British establishment. Now, a similar passage, I've shown you a similar passage like Goodwin's one, but there was criticism coming from even more unexpected quarters of the double standards. This particular photograph, you may have seen it many times, it was taken in 2020, was resurrected dozens of times on Planet Telegraph, conservative right-wing media outlets since August. And in fact, Lord Tony Sewell, whose photographs you see on the right, the British Jamaican peer who in 2020 was appointed chair of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, commented in an interview with regards to the August riots that Starmer and Rayner taking the knee in 2020 had been a disaster, alienating the majority of the population, he said, for a cause imported from elsewhere that had no relevance for Britain. And As you may know, his 2020 report had concluded against the left-wing consensus that Britain was not institutionally racist, that there was no systemic disadvantage faced by ethnic minorities, but that deprivation and inequality affected mainly the white majority. Now, there were some interesting comments at the time that even mentioned framing as a concept as creating completely different realities. To the national conservative protagonist, there is a majority population who is not far right, whose safety and living standards are being compromised by the policies of mass immigration pursued by political elites without democratic mandate. To the left-wing protagonist, Britain is full of far-right extremists, racists, and irresponsible agitators, all undermining interethnic harmony, community relations, and social cohesion. Apparently, without them, all would be well. As Goodwin says, the atrocity committed against the British people are always reframed by the political elite so that the real story is never about the real story. And as Furedi also observes, the government has the power to enforce these fictional narratives as if they were reality and to silence all critical voices. Now, at this point, I'd like to bring in two passages from Sally Jackson's work. Sally Jackson is a very well-known argumentation theorist from America. She argues in relation to the view of argumentation put forward by pragma dialectics that actually the situation is a bit different. He says argumentation is not about agreement, it's about expansion from disagreement, drilling down to reveal deeper sources of disagreement, thus externalizing and making explicit beliefs that constitute a sort of infrastructure, a deep structure on which everything on the surface rests. The arguers themselves may not be always fully aware of this deep structure, and making deeply held beliefs explicit, understanding the deep structure of our own worldview, can be one of the unintended outcomes of exploring disagreements. And there are these days many, many interesting books that are appearing, trying to drill down to the deeper sources of the so-called culture wars. I will just say a few words about one of these. One of the most recent ones, Taboo by Eric Kaufman. You may have heard of Eric Kaufman. He used to teach at Birkbeck College London and is now at Buckingham University. And his most recent book, Taboo, in this book, he advances this idea. So he says, certain identity groups have been made sacred, hence the taboo idea. They cannot be criticized and they always have priority. They are untouchable, taboo. The same taboo is seen in the discussion, or rather lack of discussion, around immigration, and particularly has been seen by all of us in the avoidance by the UK government to address the problem of migration in its handling of the riots, not just at the time, but since then as well. Cultural socialism is what Kaufman calls this orientation. It involves the sacralization of historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Left liberals worship the totems of equal outcomes and harm protection for minorities. They accept that this is the North Star towards which morality must orient. Taboo, he says, revolves around the left liberal anti-racism taboo of the mid-1960s, where it all began. And like the Big Bang, this was a cosmic event. Its logic has been progressively expanding, defining our social universes. It has introduced a zone of unbounded identitarian sacredness around race, and this powerful magic was borrowed later by other minority groups. But lasting democratic change, he says, is only possible if our moral order should cease to revolve around the sacred totems of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups, if we leave identity politics behind. That is, if discussion and criticism should become possible, if the progressive elite's speech restrictions around these taboo groups were lifted, and if the left should come to control their automatic reflex, which always seems to say minorities good, majorities bad. Okay, so now coming back to Kissin, who was talking of the moral perspective, just like Kaufman is, how might we expand a bit on what he was saying in a way that would not distort it? But so what does he mean by saying that migration should not be a moral issue? One thing he's clearly saying is that decision makers should not act from absolute moral imperatives, as in the Angela Merkel case, but adopt a consequentialist perspective, which, of course, we could argue is also a moral perspective, but of a different sort. Immigration is good if it brings benefits, is bad if it imposes costs on the host country. So immigration is not by definition good or bad, but its evaluation depends on what the host country needs, the professional skills and contributions migrants bring, and their willingness to integrate into the host culture and play by the same rules. Taking the argument back one step reveals that there is in fact disagreement at the opening stage on what this otherwise apparently shared moral point of view is to be understood as. If we take a consequentialist perspective, consequences on whom is the next crucial question. And here we arrive at one of the deepest source of disagreement between the two ideological planets, so to speak, the one that Kaufman also points out, the way the left and the right tend to privilege the interests of different groups, minorities as taboo for the left, but not taboo for the right. For the left, protecting minorities from harm and suffering seems to matter more than keeping majorities safe from harm. Protecting the human rights of minorities seems to be more important than protecting the rights of majorities, and so on, often regardless of the conflict of interest and rights that this creates and the injustice that this logic generates. So, what else should decision makers apparently, presumably not do if we take kissing seriously? They should not allow the moral perspective to be always skewed towards the interests or rights of minorities, thus creating conflicts of rights with majorities. So the radical progressive left, according to Kaufman and others, seems to operate with a deep structure of assumptions where minorities tend to be cast systematically in the positive victim role, and majorities are evil, racist, fascists, Nazis, TERFs, transphobes, oppressors. This rigid cast of characters, where the majority tends to be always the villain, can produce deeply unfair and unjust decisions. The question is how to balance the interests of minorities against the interests of majorities with no automatic privileging of taboo minority groups and without creating conflicts of rights. So you will recognize Kaufman's idea of sacred taboos as related, in fact, to the widespread framing of several strands of left-wing ideology these days as religions. As beyond debate, beyond disagreement. This is why Kiss Inside can apparently never win the argument as argument, because oppressing and failing to help and protect the victims, discriminating against minorities, are obviously and always wrong. If underneath this controversy lies a deep narrative logic of victims and villains, then, as we already agree, the argument should never be won by the villains. The heroes, the good people, should always win. They should always triumph. And this disagreement turns into a much deeper one than it appeared to be, being grounded in irreconcilable moral value perspectives, and at least on one side apparently immune to facts and evidence. So two conclusion slides. Framing is usually thought of as being salient, and it often is. A normative conclusion for the audience to draw follows in a straightforward way from saying these people are far-right thugs or racists or extremists, if the framing is accepted. Sometimes salient framing takes up so much space that it serves to conveniently frame out various elephants in the room that must not be seen, in which case the opponent might try to reframe the confrontation itself and zoom in on those elephants. But sometimes framing is not obvious and is not salient and may require some drilling down to uncover. If the unexpressed premises that are taken for granted at the opening stage were to be made fully explicit at deeper and deeper levels from the ground zero of what is actually said, some normative evaluative propositions would be very difficult to sell to the public. If the government were to say clearly, explicitly, something like this, in devising our migration policies, we must keep in mind at all times that our moral humanitarian obligations towards migrants outweigh any potential economic and cultural impacts and safety risks for the British people. Perhaps more people would sit up and listen and would find that they object strongly to such a stated priority, which is why they will not hear it in public discourse. The government doesn't say that in as many words. Only the archbishops can afford to say that our duty to Jesus Christ is our first priority, but I don't think we take them very seriously when they say this. So if the migrants should continue to be viewed invariably as victims, and presumably this is what kissing means, and if the moral angle should continue to be skewed towards their protection as an unspoken priority and a sacrosanct taboo point of view, there will be no resolution. Such disagreements may remain unresolved for the arguers themselves. However, both reframing and breaking the frame, if we manage to do that, by bringing all the unsaid into the open, or by shifting the battleground to a different kind of territory, or shifting the angle to a more strategically advantageous one, may resolve the disagreement quite clearly sometimes for a third party audience, for example, for people like us. So mass migration can be framed as a moral issue, but only if the moral case is assessed from the perspective of everyone involved, and that includes the host nation. What overriding duties a government has towards its own nation, what consequences is fair to impose on them, and so on. Thank you. So I've got 2 slides of references if you're interested, but otherwise, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Isabella. That was absolutely fascinating. In terms of this, you're in the argument. There's also the kind of framing of government. I mean, in this instance, there's like how you who is setting the frame. There's this us and them way of thinking about authority, and I mean you're arguing, the situation that you used here took place this summer with a particular government in place. But you've been studying this over time in the UK. Have you seen this kind of framing change regardless of who's in government?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I've seen it. I've seen it changed in other parties, not in the ruling parties, not in the Conservative versus Labour. Of course, there are big differences between what the Conservatives were trying to do and were being prevented to do with the Rwanda scheme and all sorts of other ideas they had. Whereas with Labour, there seems to be no such plan at the moment. I mean, if you consider that ever since Labour came to power, there's been an average of 137 channel migrants every day since the promise that the boats will be stopped, So if you have this kind of figure, so far nothing has been done, basically. This moral framing, I wonder whether it comes from the political elites as much as it comes from large sections of the public as well, that seem to see the kind of that seems to want to be, on the side of the good, the angels, basically virtuous. Like it's this idea that I don't know how to put it. It's only the kind, compassionate, whatever, tolerant towards everything, basically, that is the right way of approaching any problem. And you look at every minority, whether it's racial or whatever, sexual or trans, whatever, they're all approached in this idea that if you have any criticism, however legitimate, for example, you are evil, basically. So if you do not just disagree, we couldn't have an argument, you are evil, therefore you're outside the moral map, basically. So this moral framing, I think, is extremely dangerous, because it consigns a lot of disagreement, which could be rational and could lead to some productive solutions and so on, to the moral domain of being evil, of being a Nazi, of being a racist. You are a TERF, you're a transphobe. So there's no argument with you, basically. So I think that's what Kissin is driving at. I mean, of course, he was writing slightly before the riots, but it was exactly focusing on the riots. But it is an interesting idea that once you view everything through this lens of kindness, compassion, and uncritical tolerance of everything, and you want to be part of the virtuous, the kind, the good people, and everyone else who has some criticism or who doesn't share your views has to be an evil Nazi and so on. That, I think, is a very dangerous framing in society. So you do see it, don't you?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not
I mean,
good.
isn't
Yeah.
there fundamentally, sorry, just isn't there a fundamentally this kind of always is happening? Because the notion of the underdog being the good dog is
Mhm.
always kind of the case. So,
Yeah.
whether or not but the dogs change. But when they're under, they're good, and when they're on top, they're bad. The
Yeah.
majority,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in fact, we're seeing that in political discourse all the time. So, whether it's when those are in power, are the bad dogs; those out of power
Yeah.
are the good dogs. And this was true in America. Now this morality was played out as much by the Trump as the as the as the the Harris campaign.
Yeah.
So it was this moral argument versus rational framing is kind of always at play from everybody's side. So I'm just curious about that.
If you ask about the framing of the government that comes from governments, I think it was the economic framing that was most prominent from governments. So that was one that was always there, like migration is good because it increases GDP, right? Now that has been exploded in recent months or days. It has been completely shown not to be true, because I mean, people have been saying this for years. Actually, they've been saying, well, you look at the GDP, of course you have cheap labor for companies and so on. GDP grows, there are more people and so on in work and so on, but in fact it's per capita GDP that you should be looking at. And with an increase in population and the strain on the same resources, you have a clear decrease in the per capita GDP, that is in the um, living standards of each individual person with migration. So even now, even the official authorities are recognizing this, that in fact a low-skilled migrant entering the country, by the time that they retire or they're old and so on, will have cost the taxpayer at least £500,000 and so on. And they do not contribute, but they take, right? So that's now recognized even by authorities, that you have to be a very highly skilled migrant paying a lot of tax in order to compensate for the fact that you are a recent arrival, after all, right? And you haven't paid into the system for all this time. So this framing is more familiar, but that too is very, very um, um, deceptively presented as if it is shared common sense, that we need more migrants, we need more labor, that we need people in the social care kind of, because we don't have enough population of our own, and in Germany the same, and here we don't have enough people, so we need labor. Somehow pretending not to see that all this extra labor that comes and does menial jobs and do not contribute in terms of tax and so on, but take in benefits and whatever, will also get old, so it's like they'll be continue to be helped by the state into their old age. They also bring families that usually do not work and so on. So I was quite surprised to see, because I've been reading these arguments, the economic kind of framing, for quite a long time, and I've heard these arguments for many years, but now they finally filtered into the mainstream kind of official the Office for Budget Responsibility or all sorts of people are saying this explicitly, which they hadn't before. Hence
Yep.
the strength of the alternative framing. Like migration is good. It is good from all sorts of points of view. It is good economically as well. When in fact it's not that simple.
Okay, thanks, Isabella. Lots to talk about. Rana, please, and then Kevin
Thank
and then
you.
David.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought there, Isabel. Just one question from my point of view is with the moral framing, how practically would you say that can be kept in check, or at least the complexity explored? Because there will always be some kind of moral dilemma or moral angle, but if you look at the rights, for example, there really was as you kind of hinted at earlier, the them and us. And in those two very extreme categories, with the immigration category, you had people put in there who were part of the majority, not part of the minority, not part of the immigration minority, but part of the majority of British culture, society, who are members of minority communities within that. So, for example, the Islamophobic rhetoric that came with the riots. How does one practically deal with that moral framing without it degenerating, as it did, into them and us race categories, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I suppose, although the riots were explicitly directed against, let's say, the new arrivals, as it were, like the suspicion that this was a recently arrived Muslim, and then there was this attempt to set fire to a hotel housing recent immigrants and so on. Yes, indeed, it can turn into a more hostile attitudes towards an entire group of fully integrated people from an Islamic Muslim background that have been living here for many years and so on. And that's why it's always very welcome when people from the Muslim community stand up and say things like, to be very metaphorical, not in our name, right? So we are not all condoning this kind of thing, right? We are the law-abiding kind of majority of people who are originally from another country and so on, and we strongly disagree with what some people that also belong to, let's say, our religion or a similar cultural background are doing. So I think it would be always a lot better for community cohesion if there was more of a taking of a very clear attitude coming from these communities like Muslim or some other community, saying, we are not all of the same. We do not condone this, right? And the condemnation should come from them as well. You see what I mean? I suppose it is true that so the more governments fail to deal with these problems, the more the risk rises that totally innocent people will be painted with the same brush, which is why it is so vital that something is done to address the actual problems, I think, because otherwise you will always get a blanket kind of disavowal and rejection of migrants. Like, for example, I'm an immigrant myself, right? I'm a law-abiding immigrant. I would not like people to say, well, all Romanians are thieves or whatever. So you see, there's always this terrible danger when problems are allowed to fester and not dealt with properly. Yeah, it is. It is a problem, the one you're signaling. It is certainly. On the other hand, the arguments were that, and a lot of people have said, yes, the perception is correct, that certain minorities are allowed to protest and riot and so on. And the examples of the demonstrations in London in relation to the attack by Hamas on Israel, are given as an example. Why is all sort of incitement to violence allowed to go unchecked there, but not in other contexts? So that contributes to this feeling that a lot of people get of this two-tier, of this double standard. So why is some extremist cleric allowed to say burn all the houses of Jews and so on, and that is okay? He's not punished, whereas a woman who shares something on WhatsApp is in prison. So it's a lot of failure of policy. There's a lot of double standard, which is not going to lead to more community cohesion, I think, because there's a perception of injustice somewhere, presumably.
Thanks, Isabella. Kevin.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, I would say what I would ask is and I'm a naturalized British citizen. My wife has had a U.S. green card. We've dealt with immigration issues on both sides of the Atlantic. As an immigrant, I would just say, and so I just want to disclaim a bit, is that the problem is that the heat around the immigration issue has blurred the issues between legal and illegal immigration. So for instance, and I'll use a US example in this, the Haitian asylum seekers who were in the country legally and were accused of eating cats and dogs in the US presidential election, they were there legally. People in the community spoke about being happy to have them there because they did need workers in that community. But there was no, there were actually flat out lies by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump about their status. However, and I think you point out rightly, there were issues not of integration as much as issues of the influx did create problems with being able to provide services for these folks. And in the US, I think it's a different situation to the one that you've described in the UK in terms of the Congressional Budget Office, which informs the US Congress about financial issues in a nonpartisan way, said that immigration in the US would lead to increase of US tax rolls by 1.2 trillion, but only a 0.2 trillion increase in terms of outlays by the federal government. So it was a net benefit to the federal government and also a net benefit to GDP, and that any downward pressure on wages would be ameliorated within 10 years. So, I mean, how do we get past these sort of, quite honestly, rather thought-terminating moral arguments to get to a discussion of how that immigration legal can be beneficial, and that when we're dealing with other non-legal issues, illegal issues, that we deal with those separately? Because right now the heat around immigration is like I say, thought limiting and non-nuanced, and doesn't actually solve any problems.
Yeah, I think Kissin would say by taking a consequentialist moral perspective. I mean, countries have always needed at the various times, they have benefited and needed migrants. So they welcomed all sorts of populations coming from elsewhere. And if the country actually needs those skills, and if you can contribute, and if you can integrate and have the same values and so on, and you are not just a legal migrant, but one with that fully integrates and plays by the same rules, basically, of the political kind of community, then I would say that's the way to solve it, thinking, does this country need all this level of migration? Right now, Britain doesn't seem to need the level of mass migration that is entering the country. And the problem has never been with migration as such, but it is with a mass migration that the phase that we've entered in I don't know, a recent decade or whatever, possibly it's in Syria or whatever. So these massive movements of population with often very different values and different interests that often have not integrated into the societies which have accepted them. So the so-called populist backlash now is something that has its own reasons. It's not just an economic issue. Mass migration is not just an economic issue. It is a cultural issue. It's an issue of identity, of national identity, of preservation of values, and so on. So it is. Of course, they should be disentangled. And I would say I'm a fully integrated legal migrant, and I would not want to be put in the same boat with those that are committing crimes or being a drain on the system. I hope, although come to think of it, even somebody like me who has been here and paid tax, quite probably a sizable amount of tax for, let's say, 13 years, I still do not think, of course I do not know the figures, but I still do not think that even somebody in my position can actually even begin to pay their way in financial terms, because of course I came here at a certain point in my life. Everything I'm using in terms of infrastructure and everything, and the school that my younger child went to, was not created by me, right? You see, it was things that I took for granted So if we have a sort of more modest kind of perspective, you know, like and not feel so entitled to just move somewhere and start using everything, thinking it's mine by right. Well, you know, it's really not. You know, for a lot of people that come at a late stage in life, it's not. It's not yours by right, in a sense. You see what I mean? So economically.
But I've been a British taxpayer since I landed in this country. What's
Yeah.
the difference?
Yeah, well, I am a British
I mean,
taxpayer,
it's not by right, but if I pay taxes, I mean, if I don't pay taxes, I understand that. But you know, again, if you're a legal immigrant and you're paying taxes, I mean, it said on my visa,
yeah.
I had no recourse to public funds. And
No, but just to think about that, absolutely, I agree. So I pay a lot of taxes. But if you think about it, the kind of resources that you use once you are in another country, from the roads you walk in, from the trains, the schools, the health system, and so on, these were created by the host population and previous generations. So if you think about it in these terms, you realize that you come at a certain point where you cannot actually contribute enough to compensate for all that, if you see what I mean.
So then is an immigrant responsible for how many years of infrastructure backwards? I mean, would you argue that an immigrant would be responsible for 5 years? I mean, already a new immigrant here has to pay. So I've got an Egyptian friend who's a naturalized British citizen, and his new wife is coming here, and he already has to pay 3 years for an NHS to support. So I mean, the point that I would be making, though, is to say that there is a perception, whether it's a legal or illegal immigrant, that they are somehow a strain on the system, when there are tons of ways that legal immigration that we, you know, like in the US, didn't have access to means tested support, had to sign a document to the US, US officials saying that if my wife, had any access to means tested support, that I was personally liable to pay that agency back. And so all I want to say is, you know, I appreciate, you know, there's some nuance here, but I also think that, especially for legal immigrants, there is a misperception and also, a lack of knowledge about how much we already are contributing to the system, and I think that's lost, and it might even be lost in this conversation.
But it does highlight the point in terms of actually understanding whether you've got an economic argument to actually understand the economics, and that might be an issue to think about as we take it forward. David and then Steve, please.
Yeah, thank you, and this is brilliant. It's really sort of, yeah, how, particularly as we're sort of looking at how journalists, how the media frame stories, and I'm sort of, from that perspective, I'm sort of, you know, sort of looking at your presentation from the perspective of, well, the journalists whose role is to present facts, provide context, and maybe even go out and deliberately look for views that are often underrepresented in discussions, in debates. So with that in mind, I was sort of struck by, yeah, the data you selected in your slides. So it was commentary pieces, opinion pieces from Planet Guardian, from Planet Telegraph. But in between those slides, there was also the slide about the factual information, which didn't really appear in any of those commentaries. The ONS statistics are related to immigration, which, you know, a news story that was based on those, you know, statistics perhaps would have certainly given a different narrative, but that too would have been framed by the journalist's selection of, well, which statistics do I include? So I suppose that's sort of just sort of thinking through the data, but I suppose it raises the question of then, well, how do we frame research about framing of media coverage, you know, given that, you know, our selection of data, what data do we, what in this case, what types of news journalistic coverage do we look at? when looking at this issue?
Well, all I can give is just a couple of slides of the most interesting framing that somehow fits my perspective from an argumentation point of view. So something which can be seen as a particular argument scheme. All these articles, and I have a student who is doing actually a dissertation right now on the framing of the riots. And if you look at the corpus of 1 month of Daily Telegraph and the Guardian, a lot of the articles in the Telegraph mention such facts. And Matt Goodwin's Substack is full of these facts all the time. It's just that the passages that were most interesting to look at in terms of framing and evaluating the situation were not necessarily the ones that contained all the figures, but the figures in themselves tell a very clear story. But it's a question of how I have to select something that has to be just very brief and so on in order to make a point. Of course, the figures are coming quite as evidence in all these arguments, and they're reinforcing the claims being made by the journalists, and they're always there. I mean, they're increasingly there. Matt Goodwin particularly is full of these facts in every one of his Substack posts, but also the others. But of course, these are opinion pieces where framing is where you can look at framing rather than, let's say, neutral reporting, which will contain fewer instances of this kind of qualitative framing. They might include the idea of selecting something or deselecting, yes, of course, but not the kind of framing by classifying or by analogy or by consequences or whatever, you know. So yes, of course, it would be. It would give a fuller picture to include all of this, but it's not possible within the confines of a short talk to give so many quotes. That's why I thought, because I realized that these fragments did not have any figures, and people might think, well, this is obviously not true. It's not happening. And I said, well, let's look at a few facts, because these are facts which are repeatedly now given. The crime figures, the cost of asylum, and in a sense you can understand the public feeling from these facts. I mean, the asylum hotel bill is tremendous. The level of crime is also extremely high. So, and in a sense, people who said, like Owen Jones, there was no similarity. This was not a Muslim recent arrival, and in fact he was not. Yes, that was correct. But I wonder whether some people did not act or did not believe what they did based on some kind of similarity that I think I found striking. I mean, you have somebody unknown that is killing children at a Taylor Swift themed event, right? And then you have Salman Abedi, Manchester Arena bombing, also young people at an Ariana Grande, whatever, you know. And you could also argue, well, Salman Abedi was also Manchester born. He was born in 1995 in Manchester. He was the son of Libyan migrants, right? So he was also second generation, just like Ruda Kubana, you see. So if you look at it, you can understand how people could have made these links and said it must be this, because this is what always happens, you know. This is what tends to happen on a daily basis. So to just say there's no similarity, and you know, this is, you know, just the British citizen and so on, did not strike probably people as very, very convincing. And hence the insistence that, you know, you should look at public discontent regarding migration in order to fully understand this. You cannot just say this is just an outlier, whatever.
Thanks, Isabella. I'm going to ask Steve and Katerina to ask both to come in and ask their questions.
There was a very good documentary, if no one's mentioned it already, on the BBC last month called Immigration, How British Politics Failed. And it was interesting because it spoke about how, you know, migration was framed by, you know, Migration Watch and different parties from the sort of Labour era through coalition, through, you know, etc., to the Tory era. It was really just, I think, journalistically a good piece. And I kind of want to make a point that I think kind of David has already made, or it's a question more than a point, just very quickly about framing, and just get away from migration for a second as just the issue. It seems to me there's surely not just one frame. There's always the possibility of creating multiple frames, especially in an era when there isn't this sort of, unipolar organization of society and the media as a sort of, the owner of the means of mass media production as we were 20, 30 years ago. It feels like, to imply that there's some kind of elite that has a frame and that it applies to things and that's the dominant frame, is just, I don't know, it just doesn't add up, because, we all live, you talk about people living in bubbles and people living in silos, isolated from other points of view, etc. And it's quite possible to construct a frame that seems, both kind of coherent and dominant, and separate from other frames. But anyway, but I didn't catch the first part of your excellent presentation, so perhaps I've misunderstood the build up to that. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. Katerina, if you could come in, please.
Yes, sure. Miss Isabella, firstly, thank you a lot for thorough presentation. It was really informative. I would like to ask if, in your opinion, why is this topic of framing becoming especially relevant right now in today's informational society? Does it influence the modernization?
Yeah, well, it has been a topic for a long time, but possibly, there's also an increasing polarization of opinion. It's like the left has moved very much to the left, and this Overton window of what is acceptable to say and so on has changed quite a lot. So there's a lot of the ideological spectrum has probably become moving more to the extremes, which is why the difference in the framing is much more evident. So it's not like you can say with universal agreement that the riots were a manifestation of racism, and everyone would say, yeah, those were thugs, those were racist. Obviously, there's quite a substantial number of people who say absolutely not. We come from completely different perspective, and we're telling you that these are just people who are fed up with mass migration. They're just reacting violently to it, and it's not that they are racist. It's just that and it's not that they're extreme, it's that you as a government have become extreme, and it's not that these people have been radicalized in a bad way, but it's you as elites have become extremely radical and radicalized and extremist and imposing things on people that without any mandate, so because I think the things have moved to the extremes very much, that I think we're more aware of these possibly radical differences in framing. Because what do you do when you frame it? You're trying to persuade an audience to believe something, to do something, and there's a battle. Like Kissin says in another talk of his, he gave a talk to an audience of business leaders and so on. And he kept saying throughout, he said, we are engaged in the battle of our lives for the preservation of Western civilization. So once you see things like the battle of our lives, the battle is quite sharp and acerbic, which is why the framing becomes extremely probably polarized and very, very different on both sides. So you can't just agree on a master frame that will deal with this, So this framing of extremism and racism of the population, a lot of them will say, no, absolutely, that is not it. Yeah, well, thank you. Yes, it's an interesting question. But of course, framing is a topic that so many scientists have been endlessly talking about for quite a long time.
Thank you so very much, Isabella, and thank you all